They called her a witch. Her hands could ease suffering, but they couldn't save the dying, and that made her dangerous. When Lord Caelan Ravenshield needed someone to blame for the plague devouring his lands, he chose Brynn Ashford. At the top of Thornwatch Tower, the wolfless healer stood in chains while the village below screamed for her death. "You heal without the wolf's blessing," Caelan hissed, his young face twisted with ambition. "That makes you an abomination." Brynn looked at the crowd, people she'd delivered, wounds she'd tended. They wouldn't meet her eyes. The chains released. She fell, wind tearing at her simple healer's dress. But the cursed moors are alive with old magic. Thick fog caught her fall like ghostly hands, slowing her descent into the marsh. She crashed into black water, ribs cracking, lungs burning. When she crawled onto the muddy bank, bleeding and broken, silver eyes glowed in the mist. Not human, not quite wolf, something wild, something watching, something that would change everything.
The cold hit first. Not the impact, not the pain, just the bone-deep, soul-stealing cold of the marsh water closing over Brynn's head. Her lungs screamed for air as black liquid filled her mouth, thick with rot and ancient magic. She kicked weakly, ribs grinding where they'd cracked against submerged roots during the fall. The cursed moors had caught her like the fog had hands, slowing her descent just enough that death would be slow instead of instant. Her fingers found mud. She clawed forward, dragging herself onto the bank with trembling arms. Every breath was fire. Every movement sent white-hot agony through her chest. She collapsed face down in the reeds, coughing up marsh water that tasted of decay and something older, something that watched and waited in the mist. Through blurred vision she saw them. Eyes. Silver, not gold like pack wolves. They reflected the weak moonlight filtering through the fog, unblinking, measuring. The wolf pup was small, no larger than a hunting dog, but there was nothing domesticated in the way it moved. It circled her slowly, paws silent on the wet ground, nostrils flaring as it scented blood and fear. Brynn tried to speak, to offer the soothing sounds she'd used with frightened animals in her healing work. All that came out was a wet rasp. The pup stopped circling, tilted its head. Then the air shimmered, bones cracked and reformed with sounds that made Brynn's stomach turn. Fur retracted into pale, scarred skin. A moment later, a boy stood where the wolf had been, 6, maybe 7 years old, with matted black hair hanging past his shoulders and eyes that still held that eerie silver glow. He wore only torn leather breeches, his small chest and arms covered in old scars, thin white lines that spoke of cruelty, not accident. He didn't speak, just watched her with an intensity that was far too ancient for a child's face. Brynn tried to push herself up, gasping as her broken ribs protested. The boy took a half-step closer, head tilting like he was trying to solve a puzzle. His gaze lingered on her torn healer's dress, the bruises already blooming purple on her arms, the blood seeping from the gash on her temple. The growl that tore through the moors wasn't sound, it was force. The fog itself seemed to shudder. Birds that had been silent erupted from distant trees in a panicked cloud. The ground beneath Brynn vibrated with the weight of something massive approaching. The wolf that emerged from the mist was a nightmare given form, easily the size of a warhorse. Its fur was pitch black except where red rimmed its eyes that burned with intelligence, and something darker, madness barely contained. The beast's lips pulled back to reveal fangs meant to tear through armor and bone, and the aura radiating from it made the air itself feel heavy, suffocating. Brynn's heart stopped. This was the rogue Alpha King, the monster that legend said had slaughtered entire battalions, the cursed wolf who ruled the Outlands. She was going to die here. The massive wolf crouched, muscles coiling to spring. Brynn couldn't even scream. Her lungs were still drowning, her body broken. She could only watch as death prepared to strike. The boy moved. It happened so fast Brynn almost missed it. The child threw himself between her and the beast, his small body impossibly defiant, arms spread wide to shield her. He didn't make a sound, but his silver eyes blazed with stubborn determination as he stared up at the creature that could crush him with one paw. The massive wolf froze. A low rumble rolled from its chest, vibrating through the ground. It lowered its head, snapping its jaws inches from the boy's face, a clear threat, a command to move aside. The child didn't flinch. He stomped his bare foot in the mud and shook his head violently. The air shimmered again. This time the shift was slower, more controlled. The black wolf's form rippled and reformed until a man stood in its place. He was tall, well over 6 feet, his body a map of old battles, scars crossing his chest and arms, a particularly vicious one running from his collarbone to his hip. His hair was long and dark, sticking to his damp shoulders. His face might have been handsome once, but time and betrayal had carved it into something harder. His eyes held traces of the red that had consumed his wolf form. The curse was there, lurking just beneath the surface. "She's trespassing in the outlands." His voice was rough, like gravel dragged over stone, unused to anything resembling mercy. The boy shook his head again, more desperately this time. He grabbed Brynn's hand, his fingers small and cold and trembling, and squeezed. It was the first deliberate touch, the first gesture of protection or connection. Brynn could feel it in the way he held on like she was a lifeline instead of a stranger bleeding in the mud. Something cracked in the man's expression. His jaw tightened, and for just a moment the madness in his eyes flickered to something that looked almost like pain. "You haven't," his voice caught, "you haven't trusted anyone since your mother." The boy's grip on Brynn's hand tightened. His other hand reached out toward the man, his father, in a silent plea. The rogue Alpha King, Aldric Nightbane, stared at his son for a long, tense moment. Then he exhaled, a sound of profound frustration mixed with something that might have been grief. He walked over and knelt beside Brynn, studying her with cold calculation. "If you're a spy for Caelan, death will be a mercy compared to what I'll do." Brynn didn't have the strength to protest as he lifted her. His skin was burning hot against her frozen body, and he smelled of smoke and wilderness and something wild that made her instincts scream danger even as her exhausted mind surrendered to the darkness pulling her under. The last thing she felt before unconsciousness took her was the small, scarred hand of the boy, still holding hers, refusing to let go. Brynn woke to stone. Cold gray stone above her, beneath her, surrounding her on 3 sides. The 4th wall held a narrow window that let in weak morning light and the smell of pine mixed with something acrid. Old smoke, maybe, or the lingering scent of dark magic that clung to the cursed moors like a second skin. Her ribs were bound tight with clean linen, the work of hands that knew their business even if they hadn't been gentle about it. Every breath still hurt, but the sharp, grinding agony had dulled to a persistent ache. Someone had dressed her in a rough wool shift that scratched against her skin, and a thin blanket covered her legs. The door opened without ceremony. The man who entered was old, maybe 60, with graying hair pulled back in a warrior's knot and a leather patch covering his left eye. The right one studied her with the kind of assessment that saw through skin to bone, measuring strength and weakness in a single glance. He carried a wooden bowl that steamed with something that smelled of herbs and meat. "You're awake. Good." He set the bowl on the small table beside the bed. "I'm Osric. I set your ribs. 2 cracked, 1 fractured. You'll live, but you'll hurt for a while yet." Brynn's voice came out as a rasp. "Where?" "It's Grimstone Keep, the Outlands." He pulled up the room's only chair and sat, movements stiff with old injuries. "You're in the Rogue King's fortress now. We're the wolves the kingdoms threw away, the exiled, the cursed, the ones who didn't fit pretty enough into their pack hierarchies. His scarred mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Welcome to the bottom of the world. I need to... Brynn tried to sit up. Her ribs screamed protest, and Osric pushed her back down with one hand. You need to listen. King Aldric's law is simple. Prove you're useful or leave. No dead weight, no weakness that puts the pack at risk. And there's one rule that's carved into every stone in this place. Never speak of the curse. His single eye held hers. That red you saw in his wolf, that madness creeping at the edges, it doesn't exist, not if you want to keep breathing. Brynn swallowed. What happened to him? That's not your question to ask. Osric stood, joints cracking. Eat, rest. In 3 days, you present yourself to the king and explain why he shouldn't throw you back to the moors. He left before she could respond. The door didn't lock, but she heard footsteps in the hallway, guards, or maybe just wolves who didn't trust strangers. She forced herself to eat the stew despite her churning stomach. It was good, surprisingly so, thick with venison and root vegetables. On the second day, she noticed the boy. Kieran, that's what Osric had called him when he'd come to check her bandages. The child sat outside her door every time Brynn managed to hobble to the threshold. He never came inside, just watched her with those unsettling silver eyes, completely silent. On the morning of the second day, she found a heel of dark bread on her table that hadn't been there the night before. The next day, a bundle of wild herbs tied with fraying twine, feverfew and yarrow, the kind used for pain and healing. When she caught him leaving the herbs on the third morning, he froze like a wild animal ready to bolt. Brynn stayed very still, the way she'd learned to move around wounded creatures. "Thank you," she said softly. "These will help." He didn't run, didn't speak, just studied her with that too old gaze before turning and padding away on bare, silent feet. It was only when she'd managed to stand and move to the window later that day that she saw him in the courtyard below. He was practicing with a wooden sword under the supervision of a scarred female wolf, and when he turned, Brynn saw what she'd missed in the darkness of the moors. Burn marks circled both his wrists like shackles. Claw marks, deliberate, parallel, too precise to be from battle, scored his thin back. These weren't the scars of a child who'd been caught in crossfire. These were the marks of torture, of cruelty inflicted on someone small and helpless. The healer in Brynn felt something crack open in her chest. The summons came that evening. 2 guards escorted her through stone corridors, lit by torches, past wolves who watched her with suspicious eyes. Grimstone Keep was exactly what its name promised, a fortress of dark stone rising from the moors like a broken tooth, crumbling in places, but still defensible, still dangerous. Aldric Nightbane sat in what might have once been a great hall, though now it was sparse and utilitarian. No tapestries, no finery, just weapons on the walls, and a throne that looked more like judgment than luxury. He wore dark leather and wool, his long hair loose around his shoulders, and when he looked up at his approach, she saw it clearly in the torchlight. Red threaded through his gray eyes like blood and water. The curse was eating him from the inside out. "My son has chosen you." His voice was flat, emotionless. "I don't know why. In 2 years he hasn't shown interest in anyone, hasn't touched anyone, hasn't trusted anyone since—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "You may stay as his companion, whatever it is you do that makes him bring you bread like a stray feeding a bird. I'm a healer. I don't care what you were." He stood, crossing the distance between them in 3 long strides. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall, scarred, radiating barely controlled violence. "Here's what matters. You touch my cursed wolf with your healing magic, you die. You betray us to Caelan or any other kingdom, you die. You put my son at risk in any way, I won't just kill you, I'll mount your head on the tower as a warning to the next fool who thinks the Outlands are a sanctuary." Brynn met his eyes, saw the madness lurking just beneath the surface, saw the desperate love of a father trying to protect the only thing he had left. "I accept." Just like that, something that might have been surprise flickered across his face. "Your son has scars that weren't made by accident. He doesn't speak, but he still tries to help. I was thrown from a tower for being different. I understand what it means to be cast out. If I can help him, help any of you, then yes, just like that." Aldric stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned away, dismissing her with a gesture. "Osric will show you to permanent quarters. Don't make me regret this, healer." As the guards escorted her out, Brynn glanced back once. The rogue king stood alone in his empty hall, one hand pressed against his temple, as if fighting back pain, or voices, or memories. The red in his eyes pulsed like a heartbeat. She'd accepted shelter, but what she'd really accepted was a broken family that didn't know it was still worth saving. The old chapel still smelled of ash and abandonment when Brynn first pushed open its warped wooden door. Broken pews lined the walls, and the altar had been stripped of whatever gods the rogues no longer trusted. But the windows still let in light, the stone floor was solid, and there was a back room that had once been used for storage. It would do. Within a week, she'd transformed it into something that resembled a healing house. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters: yarrow, comfrey, feverfew, willow bark. Clay pots lined rough shelves, filled with salves and tinctures she'd made from plants gathered in the safer edges of the moors. The rogues watched her with suspicious eyes at first, keeping their distance like she might be the spy Aldric had warned about. Then the young wolf came in, delirious with fever from a wound gone septic. His name was Garrett, barely 18, and the infection had turned his blood to poison. The others had been ready to let him die. Resources were scarce, and weakness couldn't be afforded, but Brynn had seen that kind of death too many times in Thornwatch. She'd worked through the night, lancing the wound, packing it with honey and crushed garlic, forcing tea made from willow bark and yarrow down his throat when he was too weak to swallow. By dawn, his fever had broken. Word spread fast in a fortress this size. The next day, an older rogue woman appeared at the chapel door, heavily pregnant and bleeding. Brynn delivered the baby on the chapel floor while 3 wolves stood guard outside, and when the infant's first cry echoed off the stone walls, something shifted. The rogues still didn't trust her, not completely, but they respected results. Kieran became her shadow. He appeared the morning after Garrett's fever broke, standing in the chapel doorway with that unnerving stillness that made him seem like a ghost. Brynn had learned not to make sudden movements around him, not to ask questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer. She just nodded and went back to grinding dried mint leaves in her mortar. 5 minutes later, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor beside her workbench, watching her hands with complete focus. It became routine. When she went to gather herbs in the forest, he followed 3 paces behind, learning which plants to pick and which to avoid. When she treated patients, he sat in the corner, those silver eyes absorbing everything: how she cleaned wounds, how she measured dosages, how she spoke to the injured with calm authority that eased their fear. Osric found her one evening while she was sorting through dried roots. Kieran was asleep in the corner, curled up on a pile of wool blankets like an exhausted puppy. The old healer lowered himself onto a stool with a grunt, his single eye thoughtful. "You should know his story," he said quietly. His mother was Ilara Nightbane. She had the sight, could see threads of fate, read futures in smoke and bone. She saw the Pack Council's corruption, saw them selling territory to human lords, sacrificing wolves to maintain their power. He paused. They tried to warn the packs. They called it dark prophecy, called her a witch corrupting the bloodlines. Brynn's hands stilled on the roots. They burned her in the council square, made it a spectacle. Osric's voice went rough. Kieran was 5. He tried to shift, tried to fight them, but he was too young, too small. They made him watch, made Aldric watch, chained in silver so he couldn't intervene. After, he shook his head. The boy hasn't spoken since. Some trauma cuts too deep for healing. Brynn looked at the sleeping child, at the scars on his wrists that would never fully fade. The curse on Aldric was her before she died? No, that came after. A witch in the moors, angry that Aldric had exiled her coven for practicing blood magic on unwilling wolves. She hexed him as revenge. Each full moon the madness grows stronger. One day he'll be lost to the wolf completely. The weight of it settled on Brynn's shoulders. A traumatized child and a cursed king, trying to survive in a fortress of outcasts. How long does he have? Months, maybe a year if he's lucky. Osric stood, joints protesting. Don't try to fix it, girl. Some things can't be healed. But Brynn had never been good at accepting the impossible. She started creating small rituals with Kieran, gentle anchors in his silent world. In the mornings, she braided his hair, something no one else had done since his mother died. He sat perfectly still for it, eyes closed, and sometimes Brynn hummed the old healing songs her own mother had taught her, melodies meant to ease pain and quiet nightmares. She taught him to read using her medical texts, pointing out words and letting him trace the letters with careful fingers. He absorbed everything, like a plant starved for sunlight, and when she gave him simple tasks, like grinding herbs, rolling bandages, he performed them with meticulous focus. The first time he smiled, Brynn almost dropped the pestle she was holding. It was brief, barely a flicker at the corner of his mouth, but it transformed his solemn face into something achingly young. She just handed him the mortar and told him to grind the chamomile while she prepared a poultice, trusting him with real responsibility. That tiny smile hit her harder than any thank you ever could. From the battlements above the chapel, Aldric Nightbane watched. He'd been watching for weeks now, though he'd never admit it. The way the healer moved through his fortress, bringing light to places that had been dark for years. The way his son, his silent, broken son, followed her like she was the only solid thing in a world of shadows. The sound of humming that drifted up from the chapel courtyard, old songs that made something in his chest ache with memories of before. It terrified him. Hope was more dangerous than any blade. But he couldn't seem to stay away. It started with evening meals. Brynn had established a routine of eating with Kieran in the small garden behind the chapel, where hardy vegetables somehow grew despite the cursed soil. One night, Aldric just appeared, sitting down across from them without invitation or explanation. No one spoke. Brynn served stew. Kieran ate with his usual silent focus. Aldric watched them both with those red-threaded eyes, and for the first time in 2 years, the constant roar of rage in his head went quiet. He came back the next night, and the next. On the 7th evening, as Brynn told Kieran a story about a brave healer who outsmarted a dragon, Aldric caught himself almost smiling. He crushed the expression immediately, but not before Brynn's eyes flicked to his, seeing, understanding. "You're staring," she said quietly, after Kieran had fallen asleep against her shoulder. "You've made my son smile." His voice was rough. "I'd forgotten what that looked like. He's stronger than you think. He's 7 and hasn't spoken in 2 years. He communicates just fine." Brynn adjusted the sleeping child's weight, and something about that gesture, the easy tenderness of it, made Aldric's throat tight. Aldric stood to leave, but paused. "The curse, Osric told you." "Yes." "And you're still here?" Brynn met his eyes steadily. "Where else would I be?" He had no answer for that, So he did what he always did when emotions threatened to crack through his armor. He walked away. But as he climbed the stairs back to his empty chambers, he could still hear her humming in the garden below, and for once, the red at the edges of his vision seemed a little less bright. The full moon rose like a malevolent eye over Grimstone Keep, turning the cursed moors silver and strange. Brynn felt it in her bones before she saw it, a shift in the air, a tension that made every wolf in the fortress move differently. Patrols doubled, weapons were checked, and one by one, the heavy iron doors throughout the keep began to slam shut, the sound echoing through stone corridors like a death knell. "Stay in your chambers tonight," Osric had warned her at sunset, his single eye grave. "No matter what you hear, the king faces his demon alone on moon nights. It's the only mercy we can give him." But Brynn had never been good at staying where it was safe. The howls started just after midnight. It wasn't the sound of a wolf calling to the moon. It was agony made audible, a roar of anguish that seemed to shake the very foundations of the keep. It came from the North Tower, the forbidden wing where even the boldest rogues refused to go. The sound tore through the night again and again, each cry more desperate than the last, punctuated by crashes and the sound of splintering wood. Brynn found Kieran outside her door, curled into a ball with his hands pressed over his ears, his small body shaking violently. When she knelt beside him, his silver eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his face in complete silence. He pointed toward the North Tower with a trembling hand, then clutched at her sleeve, trying to pull her away from the sound. "I know," she whispered, gathering him close. "I know you're scared, but I need you to go to Osric. Can you do that for me?" Kieran shook his head frantically, gripping tighter. Another howl split the air, followed by a crash so loud it must have been a wall being struck. Brynn's healer instinct screamed that something was dying up there, something was destroying itself from the inside out. She couldn't just listen and do nothing. She pried Kieran's fingers gently from her sleeve and ran. Osric was standing guard at the base of the North Tower stairs, his face carved from granite. "No," he said before she could speak. "Turn around. Go back. He's hurting himself. He's cursed. There's a difference." But Osric's hand shook where it rested on the pommel of his sword. "The madness takes him completely on moon nights. He's not in there anymore. Just the wolf, just the rage, just the memories that eat him alive. If you go up those stairs, you die." "Then I die." Brynn held out her hand. "Give me the key." "Girl, he's not just your king. He's Kieran's father. And that boy is downstairs listening to his father scream like he's being torn apart." Her voice didn't shake. "Give me the key." Something in Osric's face crumbled. He pulled the iron key from his belt and pressed it into her palm. "May whatever gods you still believe in have mercy on you, because he won't." The stairs seemed to go on forever, each step taking her closer to sounds that made her heart hammer against her healing ribs. When she reached the tower door, she could hear him through the thick wood, snarling, roaring, the scrape of claws on stone. Her hands shook as she fitted the key into the lock. The door swung open onto devastation. The chamber looked like a battlefield. Furniture lay in splinters across the floor. Deep claw marks scored the walls, some still weeping stone dust. Blood splattered the floor in dark pools, his blood, from wounds he'd inflicted on himself. And in the center of the wreckage, backlit by moonlight streaming through the broken window, was Aldric Nightbane. He was caught between forms, trapped in a nightmare of transformation. His body was human but wrong, too tall, muscles distended, spine curved at an unnatural angle. His hands had become claws, black and wickedly sharp, but it was his eyes that stole Brynn's breath. They glowed pure crimson, no trace of gray or sanity, and they saw nothing in this room. He was somewhere else, fighting enemies that existed only in his fractured mind. "Traitors!" he roared at the empty air, slashing at phantom figures. "You all betrayed me, the council, my brother, even her, even Ilara. She left me. She left us both." Brynn took a step into the room. Aldric! His head snapped toward her with inhuman speed. For a heartbeat, she saw recognition flicker in those crimson eyes. Then it was gone, replaced by pure predatory focus. He moved like lightning, crossing the distance before she could even think to run. His clawed hand closed around her throat, lifting her off her feet and slamming her against the stone wall. The impact drove the air out of her lungs. "Spy!" he snarled, his face inches from hers, breath hot and smelling of blood. Brynn couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. His claws were digging into her shoulders, piercing skin, and she could feel warm blood running down her chest. But she didn't claw at his hand. Instead, she raised her arms, slowly, carefully, and placed both palms against his temples. Her healing magic ignited like wildfire. Golden light blazed from her hands, and Aldric's grip on her throat loosened as he gasped in shock. But Brynn didn't pull back. She pushed deeper, letting her power flow into his mind, following the threads of the curse to their source. The world tilted, and suddenly she wasn't in the tower anymore. She was in a council chamber, watching through Aldric's eyes, as wolves in ceremonial robes pronounced judgment. His mate, Ilara, beautiful and defiant, was standing in chains, her belly swollen with pregnancy. "The seer has spoken false prophecy," the head counselor declared. "She has corrupted the bloodline with her visions. The sentence is death by purification fire." Aldric lunged forward, but silver chains held him back, burning his wrists. His brother, younger, ambitious, stepped forward to give testimony. "She tried to turn him against us. She poisoned his mind with lies about our sacred traditions." "Traitor," Aldric choked out in the memory. The scene shifted. Flames, Ilara screaming, a small boy crying, held back by guards, and then darkness, and the witch's face looming close, her eyes black as pitch as she pressed burning fingers to Aldric's forehead. "You couldn't save her. You'll lose yourself just like you lost them. The wolf will consume you. You'll become the monster they always said you were." Brynn felt the curse like poison in his veins, felt how it fed on his guilt and grief, growing stronger with each moon night. It was killing him slowly, drowning him in memories and madness. But beneath the curse, beneath the pain, she could feel something else, the core of who Aldric Nightbane really was. Not a monster, just a man who loved too deeply and lost too much. Her healing light blazed brighter, attacking the curse directly. Golden power crashed against crimson madness like waves against a cliff. The curse fought back, trying to pull her under, trying to show her horrors that would break her. But Brynn had walked through fire before. She'd been cast from a tower and survived. She wasn't afraid of the dark. "You're not alone," she whispered into the chaos of his mind. "Not anymore. I see you. I see all of it, and I'm still here." The curse shattered like glass. They crashed back into the physical world together, both collapsing onto the blood-stained floor. Aldric's claws retracted, his body snapping back into fully human form as he gasped for air like a drowning man finally breaking the surface. His eyes were gray again, clear and devastated and entirely lucid. "You," he said, his voice raw, broken. "You shouldn't have come. I could have killed you." Brynn sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her shoulders where his claws had pierced deep. Blood soaked the front of her dress, and exhaustion pulled at her like a physical weight. "But you didn't." He stared at his hands, still trembling. "I didn't even know you were real. I thought you were another ghost come to torment me." "I'm real." She reached out, ignoring the way her vision swam, and took one of his shaking hands in hers. "I'm not leaving you to fight this alone." Aldric looked at their joined hands like he'd never seen such a thing before. When he raised his eyes to hers, he saw something in them that terrified him more than his madness had. Raw, vulnerable hope. Why would you risk yourself for a monster? Because you're not a monster. Brynn's voice was steady despite everything. You're a father who's been fighting too long without help. You're a king who protects outcasts because you know what it means to be abandoned. You're a man who loved his mate so much that losing her nearly destroyed you. She squeezed his hand. That's not monstrous, that's human. Something cracked in Aldric's expression. He pulled her close, careful of her wounds, and pressed his forehead against hers. You saw everything, all the worst parts of me. I did. And you're still here. I am. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing away blood from where she'd bitten her lip. You're either the bravest person I've ever met, or the most foolish. Can't I be both? The laugh that escaped him was broken and surprised, like he'd forgotten how. Then his expression shifted into something else entirely, They came at dawn, stumbling through the moors like ghosts bleeding into the morning mist. Brynn was in the chapel grinding willow bark when the alarm bells rang. Not the invasion bells, but the refugee signal. 3 short tolls that meant wolves were coming who needed sanctuary rather than fight. She ran to the gates with Kieran at her heels. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her life. 30, maybe 40 wolves in human form, covered in blood and ash. A woman clutching a bundle that wasn't moving anymore. An old man missing half his face, still walking through sheer stubbornness. Children with burn marks, their eyes empty of everything except horror. They collapsed inside the gates, and the stories they told were all the same. Purge, cleansing, hunt. Lord Caelan's soldiers had come in the night to the border settlements, to the mixed villages where rogues traded with pack wolves, to anywhere the corrupted might hide. They'd burned homes with families inside. They'd lined up healers and hedge witches and shot them in the streets. They'd pulled children from their mother's arms to test them for unnatural taint. Brynn worked through the morning in a blur of blood and bandages, her healing magic stretched thin, trying to save the savable. Beside her, Kieran moved with quiet efficiency, bringing water and clean cloth, his small face set in grim determination. He'd seen this kind of cruelty before. They both had. It was Osric who brought the proclamation. He'd found it nailed to a tree just outside the moor's boundary, a piece of parchment sealed with Caelan's signet, the words written in formal script that made them sound like law instead of murder. Brynn's hands shook as she read it aloud to the assembled refugees and rogues in the keep's courtyard. By decree of Lord Caelan Ravenshield, protector of Thornwatch and the Southern Territories, the witch Brynn Ashford, condemned for corruption and dark healing, has survived her righteous execution. This impossible survival proves that dark forces protect the corrupt and unnatural. Therefore, a cleansing is declared. All rogues, unlicensed healers, and wolves showing unnatural traits must be purged from the territories to restore purity to the bloodlines. Her voice cracked on the last words. Any who shelter the corrupt will share their fate. The parchment slipped from her fingers. Around her, the courtyard had gone deathly silent. 40 pairs of eyes turned to stare at her, some accusing, some just numb with shock. This is my fault. The words tasted like ash. He's using me as an excuse to... He was always going to do this. Aldric's voice cut through the courtyard like a blade. He stood on the keep steps, Kieran beside him, his expression carved from ice and fury. Caelan is an ambitious parasite who murdered his own father to seize power. He needs enemies to justify his rule, needs someone to blame for the plague his corruption caused. You just gave him permission to do what he already wanted. But these people, Brynn gestured to the bloodied refugees, they're dying because I survived. They're dying because tyrants fear what they can't control. Aldric descended the steps, and wolves parted before him instinctively. Welcome to what it means to be rogue. We're always the excuse, always the scapegoat. He turned to address the crowd. War Council, now. Everyone with blood older than 20 years. Main hall. The council was chaos barely contained. 50 wolves crammed into the hall, all shouting over each other. Half wanted to scatter into the deep moors, to hide in places Caelan's soldiers would never find. The other half wanted to fortify Grimstone Keep and make it a fortress that could withstand siege. Aldric stood at the head of the table, his scarred hands braced on the wood, listening to every argument with that unnerving stillness that meant he was calculating odds and costs. Brynn watched him from the side, saw the burden of leadership in every line of his body, and felt something in her chest twist painfully. We don't hide. Her voice wasn't loud, but something in it made every wolf in the room fall silent. We don't just fortify, we make them see us. All of us, every wolf they threw away, every healer they condemned, every child they scarred. We expose what Caelan really is. You want us to march into Thornwatch and politely ask him to stop? Someone sneered. I want us to stop acting like we're the ones who should be ashamed. Brynn stepped forward and Kieran moved with her, a small shadow of solidarity. Caelan's afraid because he knows if people see us, really see us, they'll realize we're not monsters. We're the ones who didn't fit into his perfect, brutal hierarchy. We're the proof that his power depends on keeping everyone afraid and divided. She's right. Osric's gravel voice carried weight. Fear only works if you can make the enemy invisible, make them just a name, just a threat. The moment people see faces, hear stories, watch children bleed, everything changes. It's suicide, Aldric said flatly, but his eyes were on Brynn, and there was something in them that wasn't quite refusal. You want to expose yourself to every kingdom, every pack that wants you dead. You want to paint a target on your back in letters visible from the moon. I already have a target. Brynn held his gaze. So do all of us. At least this way we choose how we fight. The tension in the room was thick as to choke on. Aldric straightened, and Brynn saw the moment he made his choice. If we do this, if we survive this, I'm never letting you go. You understand that? I'm counting on it. His laugh was sharp and disbelieving. You're either the bravest person I've ever met or completely insane. Still can't be both? Brynn smiled despite everything. Oh, you're definitely both. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise instead of goodbye. Let's go burn down a kingdom together. The goodbye with Kieran nearly broke Brynn's resolve before they even left. The boy clung to her in the courtyard at dawn, his small arms wrapped around her waist with desperate strength. He wouldn't look at her face, just pressed his forehead against her stomach and trembled. When she tried to pull back, his grip tightened and she felt wetness seeping through her dress, silent tears he'd never learned how to voice. I'm coming back, Brynn whispered, kneeling to his level. She cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. I promise you, Kieran, I will come back. He shook his head violently, pointing at her, then at the gate, then making a slashing motion across his throat. The meaning was clear. You'll die out there. Then your father will bring me home. She glanced at Aldric, who stood by the horses wearing borrowed armor that hid the rogue mark scarred into his skin. We protect each other. That's what family does. The word, family, made Kieran's eyes go wide. He looked between them, then threw his arms around her neck one more time before Osric gently pulled him away. The old wolf's single eye was suspiciously bright as he held the struggling boy. "Keep him safe," Brynn said. "Keep yourself alive," Osric countered. "That boy's had enough loss." The ride to Thornwatch took 3 days through territories that had once been safe and now felt like enemy land. They passed burned villages, trees decorated with hanging corpses, and signs nailed to posts, "Harboring rogues equals death." Brynn wore the fine dress and jewels they'd stolen from a merchant caravan, Lady Morvana of the Eastern Holds, a noblewoman supposedly concerned about the plague affecting trade routes. Aldric rode beside her as her personal guard, his face hidden behind a helm, his weapons peace-bonded as custom demanded. But Brynn could feel the tension radiating off him, could see the occasional flash of red at the edges of his eyes when they passed another atrocity. The full moon was 3 days away. They were cutting it dangerously close. Thornwatch Castle rose from the valley like a jeweled crown, all white stone and flying banners. But as they rode closer, Brynn saw the rot beneath the beauty. Servants moved through the courtyards with the shuffling gait of the malnourished. Outside the walls, villagers huddled in makeshift camps, their faces gaunt, their children crying from hunger. The plague Caelan claimed to be fighting, it was everywhere, and no one was being treated. The guards at the gate barely glanced at their forged papers before waving them through. Apparently, noble women offering aid were too valuable to scrutinize closely. Caelan received them in the throne room, and Brynn's first thought was how young he looked, mid-20s at most, with the kind of handsome features that would have made him popular at court: golden hair, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of winter sky. But those eyes burned with something feverish, something that made her skin crawl. "Lady Morvana," he descended from his throne with the grace of someone who'd practiced the movement. "Your offer of healers is most generous. These are dark times. The corruption spreads like wildfire." "I've seen the suffering, my lord." Brynn kept her voice pitched higher, her accent borrowed from the Eastern merchants. "If my healers can help cleanse the taint, it serves us all." "Cleanse," Caelan smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, that's exactly what we're doing. Come, let me show you the progress we've made." He led them through the castle, and with each room, Brynn's horror grew. The trophy room was a gallery of mounted heads, wolves in human and animal form, their faces frozen in final screams. Each had a placard beneath: "Corrupted healer, executed for dark magic. Rogue wolf, purified by silver. Witch, cleansed by fire." Brynn's own face stared at her from a wanted poster on the wall. The artist had captured her well enough to make her blood run cold. "The Witch of Thornwatch, 100 gold reward for capture, alive preferred for public execution." Behind her she heard Aldric's breathing change, felt his hand tighten on his sword hilt, warning him, "Not yet, not here." "Impressive, isn't it?" Caelan was watching her face. "We've purged over 300 corrupted souls in the past month. The bloodlines are becoming pure again." 300? Brynn forced admiration into her tone. "You must have excellent intelligence to find so many." "Oh, they're everywhere once you know what to look for. Any healer who works without pack sanction, any rogue wolf born with unusual coloring, any child who doesn't present on schedule. The taint hides in the smallest deviations." He was describing genocide with the enthusiasm of a craftsman discussing his work. Brynn wanted to put a knife through his throat. That night, while Caelan hosted a feast in Lady Morvana's honor, Brynn excused herself to powder her nose and slipped into his study. The lock picked easily. Healers learned to work with their hands. Inside, she found exactly what she needed: letters in Caelan's own handwriting, sealed with his signet, detailing payments to a poisoner for well contamination in target villages, reports describing how to blame the resulting sickness on dark magic to justify the purges, a ledger showing he'd sold confiscated rogue lands to human lords for personal profit. She was photographing the documents with the small crystal device Osric had given her when she heard footsteps in the hall. She barely had time to shove everything back into the drawer before the door opened. Aldric stood there, his helm removed, his eyes flickering between gray and red. "We need to leave, now." "What happened?" "Dinner. Caelan started asking questions about my lady's guard, why I wouldn't remove my armor, why my accent sounded northern." His jaw clenched. "And then he touched you, put his hand on your wrist and leaned close and asked if you'd consider staying at court permanently as his personal healer." Brynn remembered the moment, Caelan's fingers on her skin, his breath smelling of wine and ambition, his proposition wrapped in courtly language but clear in intent. She'd seen Aldric's knuckles go white on his fork. "You didn't—" "I controlled it, barely. But the moon is rising, I can feel the curse stirring, and if we don't leave now, I'll tear him apart in front of his entire court, and we'll both die here." They made it to the stables before the alarm bells rang. Someone had noticed the disturbed study, or maybe Aldric's control had slipped enough that a guard had seen his eyes. Either way, shouts echoed through the castle as they mounted their horses. The chase through the castle grounds was chaos and violence. Aldric dropped his disguise, his body shifting partially, claws extending, eyes blazing red, movements becoming inhuman. He tore through guards like paper, clearing a path to the gate while Brynn rode ahead with the stolen evidence pressed against her chest. "The rogue king!" someone screamed. "It's Aldric Nightbane, and the witch lives! She was here all along!" They crashed through the gates as arrows whistled past their heads. Caelan's voice rose above the chaos, shrill with fury and triumph. "I knew it! Dark forces protect the corrupt. Hunt them! 1,000 gold to whoever brings their heads." They rode through the night, pursued by soldiers until they crossed into the moors and the fog swallowed them whole. Only when Grimstone Keep's walls appeared through the mist did Aldric finally slow his horse. He was shaking, barely holding his human form, blood from a dozen wounds soaking through his armor. Brynn unmounted and pulled him from his horse before he could fall. "We made it. We're safe." "Safe," he laughed, a ragged sound. "We just declared war on every kingdom that fears rogues. We painted targets on our backs that will never wash off." "I know." Brynn pressed the crystal containing the evidence against his chest. "But now we have proof. We have his crimes in his own hand. That's worth the price." Aldric looked at her, his eyes clearing slightly, and something in his expression softened. "You're not afraid." "I'm terrified, but I'm not alone anymore." She touched his face, and he leaned into it like a man starving for gentleness. "We're in this together now, no going back." "No going back," he echoed. Then he kissed her, hard and desperate, tasting of blood and smoke and something that might have been hope. "Let's finish what we started." Aldric lasted 2 days before the curse dragged him under. Brynn watched him deteriorate with a healer's clinical eye and a lover's growing terror. The infiltration had cost him more than blood. Being in enemy territory, surrounded by the scent of fear and death, fighting while the moon swelled toward fullness, it had accelerated the hex like poison poured directly into a wound. His eyes bled red even in daylight now. His hands shook when he tried to hold anything, and at night she heard him pacing his chambers like a caged animal, growling at shadows only he could see. On the 3rd morning, she found him collapsed in the war room, papers scattered where he'd swept them off the table in a fit of rage. Kieran sat beside him, small hand resting on his father's shoulder, silver eyes wide with fear. "How long?" Brynn asked Osric, who'd arrived with restraints and a grim expression. "Hours, maybe less." The old wolf's voice was heavy. "The curse is consuming him faster than ever before. By tonight's moonrise, there won't be anything left of the man, just the beast, just the madness." Brynn knelt beside Aldric. His skin burned with fever, and when his eyes opened, they were more red than gray. "Ilara," he whispered, reaching for her face. "You came back. I tried to save you. I tried. It's Brynn." She caught his hand, felt the claws starting to extend. "Stay with me, Aldric. Fight it." "Can't." His voice was breaking. "It's too strong. I can feel it eating me alive. You need to run. Need to take Kieran and run before I—" He convulsed, a howl tearing from his throat. Brynn stood, decision crystallizing into desperate clarity. There has to be a way to break it, a counter-curse, a ritual, something. "There is." Osric wouldn't meet her eyes. "But it requires a willing sacrifice of the heart. Someone has to bind their life force to his, share the burden of the curse, anchor him while he fights through the memories and madness that feed it. It's supposed to be done by a true mate, someone whose soul is already tied to his." "Then I'll do it." "You can't." Osric grabbed her arm. "You're not his mate. You don't have the bond to survive it. The curse will consume you both, and Kieran will lose everyone." "If I do nothing, Aldric disappears anyway." Brynn pulled free. "At least this way we fight together. At least this way there's a chance." "It's suicide." "Then I'll die trying." Her voice rang with finality. "I won't watch him disappear into that darkness. I won't let him fight alone again." A small hand tugged at her sleeve. Brynn looked down into Kieran's face, saw tears streaming down his cheeks. His mouth opened, struggling with words that hadn't come in 2 years. Finally, barely a whisper, he managed, "Stay." The single word hit Brynn like a physical blow. She dropped to her knees and pulled him close. "I'm staying, I promise. Your father and we're going to fix this." Kieran nodded against her shoulder, then pulled back and pointed at the chapel, where his mother used to perform her sight rituals, where old magic still lingered in the stones. They prepared as midnight approached. Brynn drew the ritual circle in the chapel using ash mixed with her own blood, following instructions from a battered book Osric had reluctantly provided. Candles ringed the space, their flames casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed too much grief. Aldric lay in the center, restrained with silver chains that burned his skin, but kept him from hurting anyone in his delirium. "Last chance to reconsider," Osric said from the doorway. Kieran clutched against his side. "Brynn, not leaving him." She stepped into the circle, knelt beside Aldric, placed her hands on his chest where his heart beat too fast, too erratic. Her healing magic ignited, golden light flowing from her palms. But this time, she didn't just pour it into him, she wove it around them both, binding her life force to his in threads that glowed like molten sun. The moment the connection snapped into place, agony slammed through her. It felt like drowning in fire, like every nerve was being flayed. She gasped, body arching, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pushed deeper, following the threads of the curse to its source, dragging Aldric's consciousness with her. They fell into a void of crimson madness together. The witch's shade was waiting for them, a specter of hatred and vengeance, her eyes black pits, her smile carved from cruelty. "You think love can break what rage has made?" Her voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere. "No!" Brynn stood between the shade and Aldric's wavering form. "You feed on his pain, but pain isn't all he is." The shade lunged, and suddenly they were surrounded by fire. Ilara burning, screaming, Kieran crying, held back by guards, the council laughing, Aldric's brother testifying with a smile. The memories crashed over them in waves, each one designed to break, to crush, to make them surrender to the guilt and madness. But Brynn had lived through her own hell. She knew what it meant to be cast aside, to be called corrupt for being different. She grabbed Aldric's hand in the mindscape. "These memories are real. The pain is real. But guilt isn't weakness. It's proof you love. It's proof you're still human enough to care." Aldric's eyes, red and wild, focused on her. I couldn't save her. I failed her. I fail everyone. You didn't fail. You were chained, outnumbered, betrayed. Brynn's voice rang with conviction. And you've spent 2 years protecting your son, protecting outcasts, building something from ruins. That's not failure. That's survival. That's strength. If I lose you too, his voice cracked, I can't. I push everyone away because losing them destroys me. You're not losing me. Brynn stepped closer, and in this place of pure will and magic, she could feel the truth of her words settling into reality. I choose this. I choose you. I choose to stand in the fire with you rather than watch you burn alone. Why? The question was a broken plea. Because you're worth saving. Because Kieran deserves his father. Because She paused, then said the words that felt like stepping off a cliff. Because I love you, you stubborn, cursed, impossible man. The confession hit like a hammer. The witch's shade screamed, her form flickering. Love was the one thing the curse couldn't consume, the one thing it had no power over. Brynn's golden magic blazed brighter, and Aldric's own power, silver and wild, rose to meet it. Together, they turned on the curse. Brynn poured healing light into every wounded memory. Aldric's wolf, no longer fighting against him, but with him, tore through the shade's defenses. The battle was brutal and intimate, forcing them to face every fear, every loss, every moment of despair. But they faced it together. The curse shattered like glass in a silent explosion of light. They crashed back into their bodies simultaneously, both gasping, both soaked in sweat and trembling. The silver chains had melted, the candles had burned to nothing. Dawn light was streaming through the chapel windows. Aldric's eyes were clear silver, no trace of red, no hint of madness, just exhaustion and wonder, and something that looked like rebirth. "You saved me," his voice was hoarse. "Again. How do I repay that?" "By letting me stand beside you, not behind you. By letting this be partnership, not protection." He pulled her down against his chest, both of them too weak to do more than hold each other. "You bound yourself to me. You know what that means? That the curse can't come back without going through both of us?" "That too." His hand cupped her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "But also that I can feel you now. Your heartbeat, your emotions. You're tied to me in ways that don't have words." "Good." Brynn's eyes were already closing, exhaustion pulling her under. "Then you'll always know I'm choosing to stay." When she woke hours later, Aldric was still holding her, his chin resting on her head. Kieran had crawled into the circle at some point and was curled against her side, one small hand clutching her dress. A family forged in fire and desperation. Aldric stirred as she shifted. His eyes opened, clear, present, entirely his own. "I love you," he said simply, like the words had been waiting 2 years to escape. "I fought it, denied it, but you walked into my curse and didn't flinch. You're mine now, if you'll have me." "Mine," she corrected, reaching up to pull him into a kiss that was raw and real and tasted of second chances. "Ours," he growled against her mouth, and sealed the claim with another kiss that made promises neither of them would break. Outside the chapel, the cursed moors were burning gold with sunrise, and for the first time in years, there was no darkness creeping at the edges of Aldric Nightbane's vision. Only light, only hope, only her. The horn blasts shattered the dawn like a hammer through glass. Brynn bolted upright from where she'd fallen asleep in Aldric's chambers, her healer's instincts screaming danger before her mind fully processed the sound. 3 long blasts, then 3 more, the invasion signal. Beside her, Aldric was already moving, pulling on armor with practiced efficiency, his newly clear eyes hard as flint. "How many?" she asked, racing to the window. What she saw stole her breath. The cursed moors, usually shrouded in protective fog, had been burned away by some kind of alchemical fire. And beyond the clearing smoke, an army waited. Hundreds, no, thousands of soldiers in Caelan's colors, siege towers, catapults, wolf hunters with silver-tipped spears and crossbows, mercenaries from a dozen kingdoms, all drawn by the promise of gold and glory. All of them, Aldric said grimly. He brought every resource he has. This isn't a battle, it's extermination. The defense of Grimstone Keep was chaos orchestrated by desperation. Aldric commanded from the walls, directing rogues into guerrilla tactics, collapsing tunnel systems beneath siege towers, triggering hidden traps in the moors that swallowed entire squadrons, using their knowledge of the terrain to turn the fortress's crumbling state into an advantage. The old stones that looked like weakness became murder holes, the broken battlements became sniper positions. Brynn set up her healing station in the chapel, and within an hour it became a processing line of horror. Wounded rogues staggered in with silver poisoning, crossbow bolts through limbs, burns from alchemical fire. She worked with blood to her elbows, her magic flowing in golden streams, knitting flesh and extracting poison and pulling fighters back from death's edge just long enough to send them back into the fray. Kieran worked beside her, silent but steady, his small hands surprisingly capable as he cleaned wounds and passed bandages. He'd insisted on staying, had planted himself at her side with that stubborn set to his jaw that reminded her so much of his father. The battle raged for hours. The rogues were outnumbered 10-1, but they fought with the fury of wolves who had nothing left to lose. Still, slowly, inevitably, the tide began to turn. The mercenaries were too well equipped, too numerous, too willing to die for gold. When the inner wall breached with a thunderous crack of stone, Brynn felt it in her bones like a death knell. She was stitching a gash on a young wolf's side when she heard Kieran scream. Not the silent, open-mouthed cry she'd seen before, a real scream, high and terrified, cut short by a meaty thud. Brynn's head snapped up just in time to see armored hands dragging Kieran out of the chapel, the boy struggling and biting, but hopelessly overpowered. A mercenary captain with Caelan's crest on his breastplate had him by the scruff of his neck, hauling him toward the breached wall like a prize. "Kieran!" Brynn lunged after them, but more soldiers poured through the gap, cutting her off with a wall of silver-edged steel. Then Caelan's voice rang across the battlefield, magically amplified until it seemed to come from the sky itself. "Brynn Ashford, I have your witch child, your corrupted little pet." A pause for dramatic effect. "Surrender yourself or watch me burn him like we burned his whore mother." The battlefield went still. Rogues and soldiers alike paused mid-fight, all eyes turning toward the center of the killing field where a stake had been erected. Kieran was being tied to it, his small body rigid with terror, but his face defiant. The mercenary captain stood beside him with a torch, waiting. Caelan himself stood on a raised platform, resplendent in silver armor, young and handsome and utterly mad. "You have 1 minute, witch! Show yourself, or the boy burns!" Brynn's world narrowed to that single point. Kieran, bound and helpless, flames flickering close to his skin. Something inside her that had been carefully controlled her entire life snapped like a rotted rope. She walked toward the chapel doors. Behind her, Osric shouted for her to stop, to wait, to let them plan. But planning was done. Her boy, because he was hers now in every way that mattered, was about to burn unless she acted. "Brynn, no!" Aldric's voice roared from the battlements. She could feel his panic through the bond they'd forged, could feel him trying to reach her, but she didn't stop. She stepped through the gates into the killing field. Her hands began to glow, not the soft golden light of healing, but something else, something that burned white-hot and made the air shimmer with power. This was the magic Caelan always feared, the gift he'd condemned her for, not healing. Creation and destruction were two sides of the same coin. "I'm here, Caelan," her voice carried across the field without need for amplification. "Let the boy go!" Caelan's smile was triumphant, zealot bright. "Oh no, witch, you come here, kneel before me, accept your execution, then maybe I'll let the corrupted child live." He raised his hand and the captain brought the torch closer to Kieran's feet. The boy didn't scream, didn't cry, just stared at Brynn with those silver eyes that held more courage than any 7-year-old should need. Brynn walked forward until she stood in the center of the field, equidistant from the keep and Caelan's platform. Her hands raised, glowing. "You wanted to see dark magic, Caelan? You wanted proof that I'm a witch?" Her smile was terrifying. "Let me show you what a real witch can do." She'd spent her entire life healing, mending wounds, easing pain, pulling people back from death's edge just long enough to send them back into the fray. Using to her golden magic, Brynn reached out with her power and found every wound Caelan had ever inflicted, every villager he'd poisoned, every wolf he'd executed, every child he'd torn from their family. She felt them all, 300 deaths, 1,000 agonies, an ocean of suffering, and she channeled it directly into Caelan's mind. Caelan's scream was unhuman. He collapsed off his platform, convulsing, blood pouring from his eyes and ears and nose. His soldiers watched in horror as his lord writhed in the mud, experiencing every death he'd caused simultaneously, his mind shattering under the weight of his own atrocities. The army faltered, some ran, others stood frozen in shock, and through the chaos a massive black wolf tore across the battlefield like a force of nature. Aldric in full alpha form was terrifying and beautiful, all deadly grace and lethal power. He crashed into the guard surrounding Kieran, claws and fangs tearing through armor like parchment. The captain tried to set the fire. Aldric's jaws closed around the man's arm, and the torch fell harmlessly into the mud. Kieran, freed from his bonds, stumbled forward on shaking legs. He ran past his father, past the terrified soldiers, straight to Brynn. She caught him as her knees buckled, the power drain hitting her like a physical blow. She'd used too much, pushed too far, but she'd saved him. That was all that mattered. In the sudden silence, Caelan's soldiers backing away from their broken lord, the rogues emerging cautiously from the keep, Kieran wrapped his arms around Brynn's neck. His voice, clear and strong and unmistakable, rang across the battlefield. "She is ours. She is Pack. She is Queen." The words hit like a proclamation. Aldric shifted back to human form, bloody and magnificent, and stalked forward to stand beside them. He placed one hand on his son's shoulder, the other on Brynn's back, and addressed the army with a wolf's authority. "Your lord is broken. Your cause is a lie built on murder and poison. Any who wish to survive, leave now. Any who wish to fight—" His smile showed too many teeth. "My queen has shown mercy. I won't." They ran, soldiers and mercenaries alike, streaming back across the moors in panicked retreat. A few of Caelan's men dragged their broken lord with them, his mind shattered, his body twitching, still screaming silently at horrors only he could see. Victory! But as Brynn collapsed fully into Aldric's arms, consciousness fading, she heard Kieran's voice one more time. "She is queen! She is queen! She is queen!" And the rogues, emerging from their fortress, took up the chant. A crown forged not in gold, but in blood and protection, and choosing to stand when falling would have been easier. The healer had become an avenger, and she'd saved them all. Brynn woke to birdsong and the smell of herbs drying in the sun. For a moment she couldn't place where she was. The ceiling above her was stone, but clean stone, freshly mortared. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been repaired with new glass. The chapel, but transformed, no longer a battlefield triage center but a place of actual healing. A small weight pressed against her side. Kieran was curled there like a puppy, his breathing deep and even, his face peaceful in sleep for the first time since she'd known him. No nightmares, no tension, just a child finally able to rest. On her other side, in a chair pulled close to the bed, Aldric sat vigil. His hand held hers, his thumb making absent circles on her wrist. He looked exhausted, new scars crossing his arms, shadows under his eyes, but whole, present. The curse's red taint was gone completely, leaving only clear silver gray. "How long?" Her voice came out as a rasp. 3 days. He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "You burned through so much power breaking Caelan's mind that your own body shut down to recover, scared 10 years off my life. You're immortal. You can spare it." She tried to sit up, winced at the protest from muscles that felt like they'd been wrung out and hung to dry. Aldric helped her, propping pillows behind her back with surprising tenderness. "News came while you were out. Caelan survived your curse, but his mind—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "He experiences every death he caused on an endless loop. Can't eat, can't sleep, just screams and claws at phantom wounds. His own council declared him mad and seized power. They've offered reparations to the Outlands and a formal apology for the cleansing." "And you told them to shove their apology somewhere anatomically uncomfortable?" Brynn guessed. A ghost of smile crossed his face. "I may have been less diplomatic than that. They threw you from a tower, Brynn. They cheered while you fell. They don't deserve your forgiveness." "Forgiveness isn't about deserve." She watched Kieran sleep, remembering the boy who'd protected her when he had no reason to trust anyone. "It's about choosing not to carry the weight of hatred, about building something new instead of just burning down the old." Aldric was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're going to make me a better man, aren't you? Make me believe in mercy when I'd rather believe in vengeance." "I'm going to make you remember that we survive by being different from them, not by becoming them." Over the following weeks, Grimstone Keep transformed. The delegation from Thornwatch arrived with wagons full of supplies, medicine, food, gold, and Brynn met them not with anger but with pragmatism. She accepted their resources and put them to use, establishing healing clinics not just in the keep, but throughout the Outlands. The places where outcasts gathered, where rogues had been dying from treatable wounds because they had nowhere to go, those became her mission. The rejected wolves became the refuge. Word spread quickly. The rogue queen healed without judgment, without payment, without caring whether you had a pack or a past or any kind of pedigree. You just had to show up and ask. Aldric watched her work with something like awe. "You're building a kingdom," he said one evening as they reviewed maps of new clinic locations. "We're building a kingdom," she corrected, "one that doesn't throw away the people who don't fit the mold." He caught her hand, pulled her into his lap, and kissed her until Kieran made exaggerated gagging noises from across the room. The boy's vocabulary had exploded in recent weeks, 2 years of silence breaking like a dam. He chattered constantly now, asking questions, telling stories, making up for lost time with determined enthusiasm. The coronation happened on the autumn equinox, when the moors turned gold and the air smelled of wood smoke and possibility. There was no grand hall, no marble throne room. Instead, hundreds of outcasts gathered in a clearing that had been the site of so much death and chose to make it holy with witness. Aldric stood before the assembled rogues wearing simple black leather, his hair loose, his face open in a way it never had been before Brynn. Beside him, Kieran fidgeted with barely contained excitement, and Brynn, wearing a dress of deep forest green that Osric's mate had sewn by hand, felt her heart hammering as Aldric raised his hands for silence. "We don't follow the old ways here," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd. "We're not bound by traditions that threw us away, so this won't be a coronation by blood or birthright." He turned to Brynn, and the raw emotion in his eyes made her breath catch. "This is a coronation by choice." He produced a crown, not gold or jewels, but woven from blackthorn branches and silver moonflowers, delicate and fierce and completely unique. "Brynn Ashford, you survived a fall that should have killed you. You tamed a curse that should have destroyed me. You protected this pack when you had every reason to run. You showed us that strength isn't just claws and teeth. It's choosing to heal when the world demands blood." Kieran stepped forward, adding in his clear young voice, "You're the best thing that ever happened to us. Please stay, forever." Tears blurred Brynn's vision. She looked at the boy she'd come to love as her own, at the man who'd shown her that being cast out could be the beginning instead of the ending, at hundreds of scarred, broken, beautiful wolves who'd become her family. "I didn't survive the fall to run again," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Yes, to all of it. Yes." Aldric placed the crown on her head, his hands lingering in her hair. Then he kissed her, not for show, but like a promise sealed, a future chosen, a love that had been forged in fire and wouldn't break in the wind. When they pulled apart, the rogues didn't bow. They raised their fists and howled, a sound of triumph and belonging that echoed across the moors like a declaration of war against anyone who thought outcasts couldn't build empires. The throne itself wasn't elaborate. Aldric had commissioned it from the keep's stone and the moor's living moss, a seat that grew from the earth itself, impossible to move or conquer. Brynn sat there with Aldric standing beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and Kieran leaning against her knee like he'd done since the first day she'd let him help grind herbs. Osric stepped forward, his single eye suspiciously bright. "She wasn't thrown away," he announced to the crowd. "She was delivered, to the wolves who would never let her fall again, to the king who needed saving as much as she did, to the boy who needed a mother brave enough to walk into fire." He raised his fist. "Long live the rogue queen!" "Long live the queen!" the crowd roared back. That night, after the feast and the celebration and the pledges of loyalty, Brynn stood on the battlements with Aldric, looking out over the moors that had once seemed cursed but now felt like home. "Regrets?" asked Aldric, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "Only that it took falling off a tower to find this," she leaned back against his chest. "Think Caelan did me a favor? Don't give that bastard any credit." But his voice was warm with humor. "You survived in spite of him, not because of him." "We survived," she said, turning in his arms. "That's the point. Together." "Together," he agreed, and sealed it with a kiss that tasted of smoke and moonflowers and promises neither of them would break. Below them, in the keep, Kieran slept peacefully in a room decorated with healing herbs and children's drawings. A boy who'd learned to speak again, a father who'd learned to hope again, a healer who'd learned she was worth more than her usefulness. They weren't perfect. The world outside still feared them, threats still circled like wolves in the dark, but they had something more valuable than perfection. They had each other. They had their rogue kingdom. They had a throne built from rejection and rebuilt into belonging. And that, Brynn thought, as Aldric held her under the stars, was worth every moment of the fall. And that is the breathtaking story of Brynn and Aldric. It's a fierce reminder that being cast out doesn't mean you're worthless. Sometimes it means you're too powerful for those afraid of change. Brynn was condemned as a witch, but she proved that the greatest magic is choosing love over fear, healing over revenge, and building a kingdom from the broken pieces they tried to bury. What did you think of Brynn's choice to spare Caelan instead of killing him? Was mercy the right move, or should she have ended the threat permanently? And Kieran's first words, "She is ours," that moment absolutely destroyed me in the best way. If you loved this story of outcasts, curses, and a queen who healed a kingdom by embracing her power, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another epic tale. What story should I tell next? Drop your ideas in the comments. Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes falling is just the beginning of learning to fly.